Second World War was a defining moment in global history, with China playing a vital, yet often under-recognized role in supporting the Allied powers, particularly the United States, against Japan. The subsequent realignment of China's geopolitical stance from a U.S. ally to a partner of the Soviet Union, and later Russia, reflects a complex interplay of ideological, strategic, and historical forces that reshaped the international order. This narrative examines China's contributions to the Allied campaign during World War II and traces the factors that drove its shift toward the Soviet Union and, in the modern era, Russia. In this video, we dive deep to trace historical evidence to illuminate the strategic, diplomatic, and ideological dynamics that shaped this transformative period. In 1937, Japan, an ambitious and militarized power, launches a full-scale invasion of China. This wasn't a sudden move. It had been brewing for years. Japan had already grabbed Manchuria in 1931, setting up a puppet state called Manchukuo, and they were hungry for more of China's resources and land. The spark that set everything off was the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937, just outside Beijing. A small misunderstanding over a missing Japanese soldier during a military exercise turned into a firefight between Japanese and Chinese troops. It could have been a minor clash, but Japan used it as an excuse to launch a massive invasion, kicking off the Second Sino-Japanese War. This war wasn't just a regional conflict. It became one of the first major battlegrounds of what we now call World War II, even before Europe's war fully erupted in 1939. China's role in this war was absolutely critical, especially for the United States. Japan had a powerful military, but China's resistance tied up around 80% of Japan's forces. That's huge. Imagine Japan having all those troops, tanks, and planes free to attack other places, like the Pacific Islands, or even teaming up with Nazi Germany to hit the Soviet Union. Historian Rana Mitter puts it perfectly. If China had given up early, say in 1938, Japan might not have stretched itself thin enough to attack Pearl Harbor in 1941, which brought the US into the war. China's stubborn fight kept Japan bogged down, giving the US and other allies a fighting chance in the Pacific. But China didn't just hold the line. When the US joined the war after Pearl Harbor, China became a formal ally, one of the Big Four alongside the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union. President Franklin Roosevelt saw China as a key player, not just for the war, but for the world order afterward. The US poured support into China through something called the Lend-Lease program, sending weapons, supplies, and military advisors to help Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government keep fighting. Japan had cut off key supply routes, like the Burma Road, so the US came up with an incredible plan called the Hump Airlift. From 1942 to 1945, American pilots flew dangerous missions over the Himalayas, dodging storms and enemy fire, to deliver thousands of tons of food, fuel, and weapons to Chinese forces. It was risky. Many planes crashed, and lives were lost, but it kept China in the fight, making sure Japan couldn't focus all its energy on the US and the Pacific. Then there were the Flying Tigers, a group of American volunteer pilots who flew under Chinese command. These guys were rock stars of the skies, taking on Japanese bombers and protecting Chinese cities and US airfields. Those airfields in China were super important because American bombers used them to launch attacks on Japanese cities, hitting the enemy where it hurt. Without China's vast territory and its people's determination, the US wouldn't have had those bases to strike from. On the diplomatic front, China stepped up big time too. In 1943, Chiang Kai-shek attended the Cairo Conference with Roosevelt and Britain's Winston Churchill. This was a historic moment, the first time a non-Western leader sat as an equal with Western powers at a major wartime summit. It showed the world that China was a major player, and it helped rally international support for China's fight against Japan. Even though Chiang's government had its problems, like corruption and internal divisions, China's diplomats pushed the idea that they were fighting for freedom and democracy, which resonated with the Allies' values. So, in every way, militarily, logistically, and diplomatically, China was a cornerstone of the Allied effort. By keeping Japan tied up, providing bases, and standing firm despite horrific losses, China helped the US and the Allies win the Pacific Theater and ultimately the war. Now, you'd think after all that teamwork, the US and China would stay close allies, right? But that's not what happened. After Japan surrendered in 1945, things took a dramatic turn, and China ended up aligning with the Soviet Union instead. Let's unpack why this happened, because it's a wild story of politics, ideology, and global power shifts. During the war, China was led by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, but it wasn't exactly a smooth operation. The nationalists were dealing with corruption, a struggling economy, and exhaustion from years of fighting Japan. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, was gaining ground. The Communists used smart guerrilla tactics against the Japanese and built strong support among China's rural poor, who were fed up with the nationalists' issues. When the war ended, the uneasy truce between the nationalists and communists fell apart, and the Chinese Civil War kicked back into high gear. By 1949, Mao's communists won, driving the nationalists to Taiwan and establishing the People's Republic of China. This was a game changer, and it hit the US like a gut punch because they'd been backing the nationalists with money, weapons, and advisors. The new communist government was all about Marxist-Leninist ideas, which lined up perfectly with the Soviet Union, another communist powerhouse. The Soviets had been allies with the US during the war, but by 1945, the Cold War was starting, and the US and Soviet Union were becoming rivals. For China, the Soviet Union was a natural partner. They shared the same ideology, and the Soviets offered a ton of help, like military gear, technical experts, and industrial equipment to rebuild a war-torn country. In 1950, China and the Soviet Union signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance, sealing their partnership. This was a big deal for China, which needed all the support it could get to stand on its own. Meanwhile, the US took a hardline stance against the new China. The US was all about stopping the spread of communism, so they refused to recognize Mao's government, instead treating the nationalists in Taiwan as the real China, even giving them a seat at the United Nations. The US slapped trade embargoes on China and cut off diplomatic ties, which pushed China even closer to the Soviets. Things got worse during the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, when China sent troops to fight alongside North Korea against US-led UN forces. For China, the US looked like a direct threat, especially with American troops so close to its borders. The Korean War made it crystal clear. China and the US were on opposite sides, and the Soviet Union was China's lifeline. But here's where it gets messy. The Sino-Soviet alliance wasn't all smooth sailing. By the late 1950s, cracks started showing. Mao's policies, like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, were super radical, and they clashed with the Soviet Union's more cautious approach to communism. The Soviets wanted to play nice with the West sometimes, but Mao wasn't having it. There were also border disputes and arguments over who should lead the global communist movement. By the 1960s, this led to the Sino-Soviet split, where China and the Soviet Union basically went their separate ways. This split opened the door for something unexpected, a thaw with the US. In 1972, President Richard Nixon made a historic visit to China, and by 1979, the two countries normalized relations. This wasn't because they suddenly loved each other. It was a strategic move to counter the Soviet Union, which both saw as a bigger threat. Fast forward to today, and we see China and Russia teaming up again, but it's a different kind of partnership. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Cold War ended, and the world looked like it was dominated by the US. Both China and Russia weren't thrilled about that. They started working together in the 1990s through groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, focusing on things like regional security and economic cooperation. They shared a goal: pushing back against the US-led global order, especially as the US expanded NATO and got involved in places like the Middle East. This partnership really took off in the 2010 and hit a new level after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. China didn't condemn Russia. Instead, it ramped up trade, buying Russian oil and gas while Russia faced Western sanctions. They call it a no-limits partnership, but it's not all rosy. There's some mistrust. Russia's wary of China's growing influence in places like Central Asia, and their economies are very different, with China being much bigger. Still, they're united by a common goal, challenging the US and creating a world where they have more say. So, there you have it. China was a powerhouse ally for the US during World War II, holding off Japan, providing bases, and standing tall at diplomatic tables, all of which helped the Allies win. But after the war, the rise of the Communists, the Cold War, and US policies pushed China toward the Soviet Union. The Sino-Soviet split later opened the door to a US-China rapprochement. But today, China and Russia are back together, teaming up to challenge the US. It's a story of war, ideology, and strategy, showing how alliances can shift and shape the world.